Hello and welcome to this lecture on how to measure body weight. A few key things that I hope you'll get out of this lecture: understanding how we might define a healthy body weight, also understand how the terms underweight, overweight, obese, and morbid obesity are defined, understanding health risks associated with particularly obesity and morbid obesity, and then identifying 3 methods used to assess body composition and obesity risk. So how can we define a healthy body weight? All these various ways. I think one of the most important things is that a healthy body weight is acceptable and comfortable to the person in that body. We might also say that a healthy body weight promotes healthful eating habits and allows that individual to participate in regular physical activity. The body weight is definitely going to have somewhat of a genetic influence and a genetic component. So based on the family, the person might tend to be leaner or might tend to carry a little extra weight. And the shape of the body would definitely be defined by genetics. So there's no one standard for what a body should look like, or certainly no one standard for what a healthy body should look like. We can also say that a healthy body weight would allow for healthy levels of blood pressure, healthy lipid levels, and a healthy blood glucose and insulin tolerance levels. Also, a healthy body weight is one that can be maintained without limiting food intake or constantly dieting. And the body weight would be appropriate for age and physical development. So again, a big takeaway is that there's not a specific standard for what a body should look like or how much weight a specific body should hold. We can evaluate body weight in 3 ways: body mass index, body composition, and fat distribution patterns. Body mass index is one of the most common ways to measure body weight. It's very simple and very straightforward. It's also not necessarily the best indicator of health, because as I just said, there is not really a standard for what a body should look like or how much weight a body should carry. However, BMI sort of pigeonholes us in saying, well, if you're at a certain height, your body should only weigh within this range. So it's a commonly used tool. I think it's important to know that it's very limited. So the way to measure body mass index is taking a person's weight and dividing it by their height squared. You can do that using the metric system, or using the American system of pounds and inches. And then there are 5 classifications of body weight based on body mass index. The classifications are underweight, normal weight, overweight, obese, and morbid obesity. And you can see the ranges here. So when you run this calculation, you'll get a number that ranges between, the high teens and potentially the high 40s if morbid obesity is the case. A healthy body mass index would be between 18.5 and 24.9. And again, just a chart showing the BMI classifications. This chart does not include underweight. Certainly, there are health risks associated with having a BMI below the normal range. And now, more recently, as of the past 20-30 years, with obesity on the rise, we've further classified obesity by class 1, class 2, and class 3. Above 40 is considered morbid obesity, where the excess weight is itself a health risk and actually a risk of death. So as I mentioned, BMI is very limited. Perhaps the most critical thing that BMI does not consider is body composition. So in this example, these folks are the same height and the same weight, so their BMI would be the same and would be actually classified as obese. This individual obviously has a body composition that's quite muscular, and this person, we're guessing, has more fat mass. In this case, we know that extra fat mass is a health risk, whereas extra muscle mass is a much less of a health risk. So just by looking at BMI alone, we wouldn't have any indication of whether the extra weight is fat mass or muscle mass, so we wouldn't have much indication as to the severity of the health risk of this BMI. So a much more indicative way of determining body weight is to measure body composition. Body composition measures not only, well, measures fat mass as well as lean body mass. You might see fat mass also called adipose tissue. Adipose is the name given to fat stored on the body. And you might see lean body mass referred to as lean tissue. And you might also see it referred to as fat-free tissue. So fat-free tissue is referring to everything, including your muscles, your bones, and your internal organs. So pretty much everything else that the body is without including the adipose tissue. So ways to measure body composition, similar to measuring your estimated energy expenditure. Some of these machines are very expensive. So underwater weighing, the Bod Pod, and the DEXA are all fairly expensive machines. Most of us don't really have access to these machines. Even most doctors' offices don't have access to these machines. They're more seen in nutrition research settings. So the two most inexpensive ways and most accessible ways to measure body composition are skin fold calipers and bioelectrical impedance analysis. Skin fold calipers, I'll show you a picture on the next slide. It's literally taking a measurement tool and folding pinching the fat on different parts of the body. Like you might pinch the abdomen, you might pinch the upper arm, the upper thigh, and then measuring the thickness of the fat. That's using the skin fold measurement. Bioelectrical impedance, you would need a small machine and you put a little electrode on the back of your hand and then another one on the back of the foot. And this machine would send a very low electrical impulse through the body. That impulse would be transmitted via the water in your body. So our bodies are 60 to 70% water. So important to use this machine when you're well hydrated, because if you're dehydrated, the machine will read incorrectly. We know that muscle mass has more water content than fat mass. So the impulse will be able to move faster in muscle and will move more slowly in fat. So depending on the speed of the impulse transmission through the body, the machine will be able to determine roughly what percentage of the body is fat mass and what percentage of the body is lean muscle mass or fat-free mass. So here on the left, you see the skin fold calipers measurement, and then on the right is underwater weighing. Underwater weighing is actually the most accurate measure of body composition, but again, have to have access to these types of machines. And then finally, another way we can look at body composition is through something called fat distribution patterns. Fat distribution pattern is, as it says, considering where the fat is held on the body. Basically, there's two primary different places. We could hold fat in our abdomen, or we could hold extra fat in our upper legs or buttocks, so kind of below the waist. So that's fat patterning. Then there's two other measurements we can do: waist to hip ratio and simply waist circumference. So we'll look at each of these more closely. We'll do waist and hip circumference first. So it's pretty straightforward. Take and tape measure, measuring the waist, which would be about the narrowest part of the abdomen. Some people will do it right about the navel or the belly button. And then measuring the hips, which should be about the widest part. So right around the hip bones or the widest part of the buttocks. And in waist to hip ratio, you're going to compare the circumference of the waist to the circumference of the hips. For men, if that ratio is above 0.9, it's indicating an increased risk for chronic disease. For women, the ratio above 0.8 indicates increased risk. And then you could simply just measure waist circumference without measuring hips. So waist circumference over 40 inches and for men and over 35 inches for women is considered increased risk for chronic disease. Now the reason for measuring this, I'll go to the next slide to explain. The reason for measuring this is because of where that extra fat is stored. So if the extra fat is stored around the abdomen, this is where we have our vital organs, our liver, our digestive organs. You might start to influence the bottom of the lungs. the spleen, the gallbladder. And so these are our vital organs. Fat can and does act as a hormone and can influence, as an organ, and will produce hormones that can then influence other organs. So when we have what's called visceral fat refers to the deeper fat that might be found in and around the vital organs. This type of fat can negatively influence the functioning of the vital organs. So having visceral fat in the abdomen is much, much riskier for health and puts the body at a much higher risk for chronic disease compared to fat stored down here around our hips and our buttocks, where we don't really have vital organs whatsoever. So by measuring the waist circumference, we get an estimate of how much fat is stored in the abdomen. And then if we compare it to the hips, ideally we want to have a higher circumference around the hips than we have around the abdomen. And then the apple shape is just referring to that extra fat stored in the abdomen, and the pear shape is referring to that extra fat stored around the buttocks and the upper thighs.